Our next speaker has been an advisor, a policy advisor to some of the most influential policymakers on the planet. I'm also the director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. He is thoughtful and polite, but don't let that fool you. He's an agitator, for sure. He said to me, he said, I'm someone who is just consistently unsatisfied with the status quo. I think that's a good place to be, right? He tells me he spent 30 years working on the soda tax issue, right? So do you think now, like with all the momentum behind that, do you think he's happy? No, I don't think so. Actually, just a couple of hours ago, he set out a really ambitious goal, right, for the movement of continued success of that movement. So I think if you ask him, he would tell you, no, he's not happy, that we're just getting started. Please everyone welcome Kelly Brownell.
Thank you very much, David. That's very kind. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed today's meeting as much as I have. One of the things that happened to me today is I had a question that I've long had answered, which is really nice. And that question is, what is the world's smallest font? And then Scott delivered that map, and now I know. But no, and then Jim shows a map with an even smaller font. So Jim, thank you. You are a living legend. So I'd like to discuss for a few moments some lessons that I've learned, and some lessons that have humbled me in very important ways. At Duke University, we've created a World Food Policy Center that is meant to work at the intersection of four fundamental areas of food concerns. Food insecurity, hunger, malnutrition, stunting is one cluster. Obesity, overnutrition, chronic disease is the second cluster. Agriculture, environment, which is a very large cluster, is the third. And food safety and food defense issues is the fourth. And we entered this enterprise with a hypothesis that some of the magic that can occur will occur at the intersection of these areas. But the world hasn't been able to experience that magic because people are working in segmented areas, and people working in one area tend not to interact with people in other areas. And a classic example of that is people working on food insecurity haven't interacted historically with people who work on obesity. But those two problems are connected, as Dr. Gavin said, by a common set of social drivers. They have a common biology in some ways. And so that lack of connection has created real problems. And one can see many examples where the lack of connection is creating issues. So for example, USDA policy that dumps commodity crops into schools, like butter, for example, might be a win for the dairy farmers, but not so good for the kids. And one can have a very long list of these sort of things. So at the intersection of these areas reside some very interesting possibilities for moving forward. And you tend, if looking at these areas together, you tend to look at things that you might not have otherwise looked at. So issues like food waste, for example, all of a sudden becomes interesting. Because if you could successfully deal with the food waste issue and food loss issue, you could simultaneously address food insecurity, obesity, and environment, and that would create a number of wins at the same time. Now, part of our work is to look at big global and national policies, but also to work very locally. And in that local work, we're working with a moderate-sized urban area, Durham, North Carolina, and a very poor rural area in North Carolina, Edgecombe County, to create model food communities. And the hope is within these communities, you can try to get everything right regarding food to the extent humanly you can. That will create wins across these different areas. So as we've entered these communities, we've learned some very important lessons. And one of the most important lessons that I'd like to convey tonight is about ownership. In the rural North Carolina county, Edgecombe County, which I mentioned is very poor. Of the 100 counties in North Carolina, it has the 98th worst health indicators. I've met a man named Reverend Richard Joyner, a remarkable individual who's become a very dear friend. He's an African-American pastor in a very small church. The whole church is 29 families that sits across from a cotton field in Edgecombe County, North Carolina. Reverend Joyner has told me several stories that I found very moving and have been very enlightening to me. One is that when he grew up on a farm with a mother and father who didn't read or write. They rented land from a white landowner and worked very hard. He had 12 siblings, and they worked very hard on the farm just to scrape by and make a living. He was telling me one story of the white landowner and how racist this man was. And one of the ways that this was expressed and how the white landowner would allocate mules to the different families that were farming the land. And he would take the most rundown, sickly mules and give them to the black families. Now, Reverend Joyner was saying when he and several of his brothers were teenagers, they were given an especially sickly group of mules, and he and his brothers were very angry, and they wanted to go hurt the farmer. And what their father said was, instead of me giving you some way to go hurt the farmer, I'm going to give you a brush and a pail of water, and I want you to go give those animals a bath, and I want you to make them feel good. I want you to treat them as if they're your brothers and sisters. And in a short period of time, those mules came back and became some of the most vital ones on the farm because they were well treated. So this gives you the sense of the heart of the father of the man that I know. Now that father and the mother, with the 13 children, finally saved enough money to buy a piece of land from the white landowner. After years and years of work, to buy a small piece of land. They went to sign the contract. The white farmer had written the contract so that he kept the land and took the money from the family. The Reverend Joyner has talked about the deep despair and poverty that this thrust that already poor family into, and the generations of pain and trauma and ways that this one event that occurred at a moment in time created for that family. And part of the outcomes that have now lasted several generations has been diabetes and other health-related concerns. So Reverend Joyner we were in touch with him because he was becoming very concerned after presiding over funeral after funeral of essentially young black men who were dying of the complications of diabetes. Now, the default would have been for him to approach Duke, University of North Carolina, some other academic institution, say, come help us with this problem. What would have occurred then? And this is the kind of default, the way these things occur. The experts would have come in and said, okay, we know what's going on, a product of diet, physical inactivity. We'll design an intervention for you. We'll do some sort of a trial, and hopefully things will get better. Now, in this exchange is a lot of symbolism. The symbolism of mainly white people telling black people, we know what's wrong, and we have the answer for you. Wealth gets exchanged in this interaction because somebody benefits from it. But who benefits? It's the researchers who are getting publications, getting grants to do the work and things like this. And very little is left behind in the community. Now, Reverend Joyner, an enormously wise man, decided not to use the default approach, and instead what he did was he created a farm. He got some land donated. On that farm, youth in the community work. They sell CSA boxes to the local hospital. They get food into the local schools, and they feed a number of local people through this farm. And there is some wealth being generated from this, but it remains in the community because the idea was owned by the community. The wealth remains in the community, and it becomes a much more permanent solution than what generally happens. So what I'm urging us to think about in our own work is who owns things? Who owns the land? Who owns the process where the food gets created and gets to people? And can we understand that system and the history of that system that goes way back in America? Take redlining, for example. Redlining created neighborhoods where people couldn't get credit and buy property. So it created this system where people were not able to accumulate wealth, and therefore were behind the 8 ball from the very beginning. Well, that redlining also created credit deserts where people can't get credit to do things like start new businesses to help address some of these food-related issues. So to assume one can go into a community and create an intervention that's not owned by the community, not generated by the community, and to expect for that to have permanent effects is wishful thinking in many ways. One more example of this, something that's common in a number of places around the country are to create things like veggie vans, where you might buy a truck, outfit it to sell fruits and vegetables, and take it into food deserts to help get people better access to fruits and vegetables. A very well-meaning effort, to be sure. If these are studied, the results are probably positive. But again, what does it symbolize to do something like this? Generally, it might be an NGO that gets money from a foundation. The NGO then hires people to drive the veggie van. It goes into the neighborhood. It leaves the neighborhood at night. The wealth that gets created from this goes to the people employed by the NGO, and it's not owned by the neighborhood. Wouldn't it be better if some entrepreneur in the community were able to get credit to buy the veggie van, outfit it, drive it, hire people to help run it, and whatever wealth is created remains in the community? So that issue of understanding the history of how food systems develop is so important, and it leads us down some very different roads than we might have gone otherwise. So instead of us or anybody coming from the outside and telling the community what might be good for them, can we hear the voices in the community? Can we elevate those voices? Can we give credibility and credence to those voices so we can learn what are the realities of a broken food system? How can we develop interventions based on that? And how can we leave something behind so that the parallel of Reverend Joyner's family losing land doesn't get replicated in the way we try to address food systems going forward? So I've learned a lot about issues of race, of history that many of you already know, but it's been very illustrative to us, and it's completely changed the way we're approaching these issues. So we believe that working at the intersection of these areas has a lot more promise than just working on obesity in isolation of the other problems. But then in order to do that, we need to learn from the people who live in the communities who are dealing with the problems. Thank you.